And welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, joined by my co-host, Matt Giraldi.
What's going on, guys?
We're here today to talk about the top 15 tight ends. So without further ado, let's get into Tier 1. And right off the top, we got the elites. This is going to be a 4-player tier here, starting off with Travis Kelce. I think I'm pretty unique with having Kelce at 1. I know that there's been rumors that he might scale back his workload a little bit, that he might play less snaps, but I'm really not that worried about it. As long as he comes into the season healthy this year, the snaps he does play, I expect that he's going to get heavily targeted. And so for me, I think the history, and until we see him really drop off in production, because last year he didn't really drop off that much in production. He was still top 3 tight end, and he dominated in the playoffs. So I think he was just getting healthy over the course of the season. And I really expect him to come into the year as the number 1 option, especially if we get a Rashee Rice suspension, which, the fact that we haven't gotten news on that is still a little bit murky. And maybe they push that an additional year, kind of like they did with Alvin Kamara. But if there is a Rice suspension and Kelce gets a chance to get going early in the year, while those other 2 weapons are trying to get established, Worthy and Brown, both first year on the team, one's a rookie, one's a free agent signing. So my thought and my expectation is that Kelce is going to ascend back into that top position. He's going to be the focal point of the offense, especially in the middle of the field, because both of those guys have big time speed. And I expect him to be kind of right back in that top position.
And I think you're going to get quite a bit of them this year. I mean, the consensus has kind of been
I
LaPorta
hope
at
so.
number 1. So I feel like he's the guy that you're going to have quite a bit of exposure to.
Yeah, I really hope so. I've been finding in mock drafts that I haven't been getting him a lot because I'm not all that comfortable taking him in round 4. And maybe I should get more comfortable taking him in round 4 and kind of figuring out my third wide receiver more in the mid rounds. But overall, really like Kelce, and I really hope I can get him in round 5 of again super flex drafts. But all these tight ends are getting pushed down because of this top tier here. So, if I can get him in round 5, especially if I have an early pick and, he's kind of there with the 4 or 5 turn area, hope maybe somebody likes McBride more or somebody likes Andrews more, and then Kelce can even fall further. All right, so getting into number 2, you alluded to it, Sam LaPorta. This is your number 1 tight end. So what do you got for us on LaPorta?
Yeah, so he's kind of my 1A to Kelsey's 1B. He's really that athletic, do-it-all tight end that seems to be above average at just about everything. And he's in a great offensive system under Ben Johnson. He's the clear number 2 option on the team. I know we're already hearing a lot of buzz about Jameson Williams taking a step forward. And, while I hope and expect that he does take that next step in his career, I still don't expect Williams to turn into a target hog that really cuts into obviously St. Brown, but as well as LaPorta's high target share. I do worry that his 10 touchdowns aren't necessarily sustainable, because if you look at like some advanced statistics, they had him closer to like 6 touchdowns. So there's definitely a negative regression that could be happening there. Where he's currently being drafted, I just feel like, unfortunately, I'm going to be going in another direction, because you really do have to pay that high price for him. And I just worry that if he does take a step back and scores 5 or 6 touchdowns this year, then it's not going to be worth that, high draft pick, whether it's standard leagues or super flex.
Yeah, and that's the main point right there at the end that I struggle with is at the price I can't do it. If he does fall outside the 3rd round of Superflex drafts, he's going like around guys like Devontae Adams. He's going well before Derrick Henry. He's going before Travis Etienne. Like I just don't know that I can do that, if I'm being honest. And I really feel like tight end is deep this year. My favorite player to draft at tight end goes really late because he's like kind of 7 or 8 in consensus, and I have him at 5. We'll get into him in a second. But LaPorta is just somebody that I struggle to buy into at this price.
Yeah.
Number 3, somebody that I really like and somebody that I just don't understand how he's going 4 or 5 amongst tight ends is Mark Andrews. he has been excellent throughout his entire career. He got hurt last year, so I do understand that maybe there's some additional injury risk, but he's still relatively young. He's under 30. He's still the number one target in the Ravens offense, so I expect him to be Lamar's go-to, especially in the red zone. And he played 10 games, scored 6 touchdowns last year, so it's 10 touchdown pace, just kind of like we expect from him. And so I think that there's just a little bit of whoever owned him last year has like maybe is a little bit upset the fact that they didn't have him towards the end of the year and that he wasn't able to get back on the field. But overall, I don't have a single problem with Andrews. I think going into this year, you got to look at the fact that he can get 8 targets a game, and that's just not something that you get from a lot of tight ends. And he can be the number one option in a way that the guys that we're going to talk about next just aren't going to be. And his competition in the wide receiver room, not to say that it crosses over that much, but you alluded to that a little bit with LaPorta. So it doesn't cross over that much, but like the number one on his team is Zay Flowers. And I just don't know that that's going to be somebody that can pull away targets in the same way as the next player that we're going to talk about. So I think that Andrews has a very established role. We know exactly what we're getting from him, and that's something that I really, really am attracted to at the tight end position.
Yeah, and like we've talked about a bunch with the Ravens offense, they're going to be a very concentrated offense on a few players. Yep. You and I are very high on Andrews. We've done a bunch of content on him, so he's someone that I feel like, again, we're going to be getting quite a bit because we've seen him as low as 4 and even 5 in like some crazy formats. So yeah, very excited about Andrews.
Yeah, and like I get him a lot in drafts just because he does fall. McBride, Kincaid even is sneaking ahead of him. So he's somebody that if you can get a little later in the draft, I think is a great value at tight end. So going into number 4, we talked about him in a little bit as part of the Andrews breakdown, but it's Trey McBride.
Yeah, and so like you, Trey McBride is also my tight end 4. Now last year, we didn't really see him take off until week 8 after Zach Ertz went down with an injury in week 7, but from week 8 onward, he was just a stud. He was averaging 11.7 half PPR points per game, which was the best amongst tight ends. And unlike LaPorta, McBride kind of underperformed in terms of touchdowns, scoring only 3. When the advanced stats had him closer to that 5 range. So I would expect more of a positive regression in this regard. Now, the addition of Marvin Harrison Jr. does obviously scare me quite a bit. Yep. But they were the 6th place team in terms of vacated targets this offseason with 217. And those aren't all going to go to Harrison. I would expect Harrison to be in that, 125 plus range, but, I think they're going to focus on McBride quite a bit. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten him in a bunch of drafts just because there are people that are pushing him up very high that I'm not necessarily willing to pay for. But if he does fall into that 4th spot, he is the last player in that tier 1. And, like we've talked about, you do want to target players at the end of your tier. So, if he does, then I have no problem taking McBride.
Yeah. And, I'm nervous on McBride. We saw a small sample size end of year where he was the top option. So the fact that there's so much changing, I feel like, hoping to see it over a full season, right? That's going to be different. Hoping to see it with Marvin Harrison Jr., who's like a bona fide number 1. Hoping to see it over a full season with Kyler as well. Where Kyler might be more inclined to run, which he did at the end of the year. But, a healthy Kyler is probably going to play a little bit more free and loose than he did at the end of last year. So I'm nervous. I'm really nervous about Trey McBride. I've seen people push him all the way up to 1 because they think, okay, Marvin Harrison's going to pull attention away. The wide receiver target's going to go to Harrison, and McBride is going to attract even more of those vacated targets, like he said. Anything that was going to Ertz, all of that work is going to go to McBride, but I don't know. I don't know what it is. I think I just need to see it over a full season before I'm going to buy in. And at the price, even if it is the number 4 price, right, because there is such a drop in price from 4 to my number 5 tight end. Once Andrews is gone, I usually just look away from tight end for multiple rounds. And I start looking towards the mid rounds at tight end. So anyways, not to completely deter you from picking McBride, but I just do not think I'm going to have him on any team this year. It would take something pretty crazy for me to get him, I feel like, at this point. All right, so getting into the second tier, the near elites. So we got a couple guys in this tier. And for me, I've alluded to this guy a couple times now. My number 5 tight end is Evan Engram. And I have him at 5, and he goes around 7 or 8, and he's usually down in the 7th or 8th round of Superflex drafts, and that's the player that I'm really targeting down there, because he had a crazy number of targets last year, and he literally was 4th in the entire NFL in receptions. And the role's not going to change, I don't think. Lawrence loves to dump it off to him, loves him over the middle of the field. They moved off of Calvin Ridley and they brought in Brian Thomas Jr. So like the outside weapon might not be as good as well. So, there's a possibility anyways that there's even more volume for Engram. And so I'm not sure I understand why all of the attention is going to this next player. Or, I guess I understand McBride because he did show a lot of upside last year. He had multiple 20-point games in half PPR. So I can buy into McBride's upside. But with Engram, I feel like you're getting a very consistent producer that is in an established role that rolls over from last year. And for me, it's just the consistency and the set it and forget it nature of drafting him is something that I really want in my tight end. And so that's why I think I've been drawn so much to him as a player that I want to draft.
Yeah, and like you said, if his consensus is 7 or 8, then it's free money for where you have him valued. And like you said, with plug and play, I had him in a few leagues last year, and he paid off pretty well, especially toward the end. So I like him a lot too, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and so whether or not you agree with me, I know that Evan Engram has been kind of a polarizing figure throughout his career. When it started with New York, and he was supposed to be very good, and took him a while to get going. But I really think that this is his best situation he's been in, and that he's going to produce again this season. So, all right, and then moving on to the next guy, we've got number 6, Dalton Kincaid.
Yeah, so Kincaid right now I have at 5, so ahead of Engram by 1 spot. And if you would have told me last year that Diggs would play a full healthy season, finish as the wide receiver 10, and Kincaid would be the number 2 target getter on the team, I would have expected a lot more production out of Kincaid, to be honest. And, after watching his role and how he dominated at Utah for so long, I had pretty lofty expectations for him, of which he kind of fell short. He only averaged 7.1 half PPR points per game, which was 14th amongst tight ends, tied with everyone's favorite player, Hunter Henry. The Bills do, however, have 317 vacated targets, which is 2nd in the NFL. And maybe more importantly, Diggs and Davis accounted for 80% of the Bills' red zone targets last year. So when you're kind of painting this picture of what Kincaid can be, there's all these underlining factors of targets and red zone share and athleticism and draft profile and all of these things that, I think allows for him to have a very high ceiling. But the thing that kind of scares me the most, and what not a lot of people really want to admit or talk about, and maybe they'll change this next year, is when Dawson Knox came back from injury week 14 through the divisional round, Kincaid averaged a 57% snap share. And I just have a hard time, one, believing that that's going to be the case this following year, just based on his talent. But 2, it's just not something that I can necessarily look past with confidence. I don't know. What do you think about Kincaid this year?
You hit the nail on the head with the last stat. I'm really worried about him not passing Dawson Knox on the depth chart. And I get Knox is more of a blocking tight end. He's not going to take a lot of targets, but I don't want to look up at halftime at the 2-minute warning and see Knox have 3 for 40 and Kincaid have 3 for 28. It bugs me. That's the sort of thing that I like to avoid with fantasy picks when I can. I don't want other players on the same team at the same position performing equitably, basically, right? I struggled with that with Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith. I think everybody kind of did last year, but it happened here as well. And I understand the upside, okay? Everything you laid out makes perfect sense, okay? They have all these vacated targets. He's likely going to be featured. He's a first round pick as of last year. He showed when Knox was down that he could handle the workload. So we know he can do it, right? It's not like we're wondering if the talent's there. It's not like we're wondering if he's going to develop into a player that can be a high-end producer. There's none of that in my mind. He can do it. I think it's just a question of, is he going to be the featured player on the offense consistently? And I'm very worried that the answer to that is no, that he's going to be featured in 10 of 17 games. And, maybe that makes him worth, or, to me, that makes him worth the 6th pick at tight end, right? That's very good production in 10 out of 17 games. I'm afraid that those other 7 games are going to be very disappointing, right? And you're going to get 3 or 4 points. And it's like, well, why did I pick this guy in the 5th round, right? Why did I pick this guy in the 6th round if he's going to be putting up stinkers every other week? And so that's why I struggle with him. And, if I'm wrong, I'll be happily wrong. The offense runs through him, and next year he's going to be a top 2 tight end. I could see that path happening as well. So
Sure.
I'm just worried about for this year because we haven't seen it yet, and I'm just not 100% sure of how the offense is going to operate. Right? It's going to be a very different offense compared to last year. And so that's why I haven't pushed down a little bit. And, the jump from going from tight end 14 up to tight end 6, I feel like that's still a major leap in terms of production. So I still feel like this is a fair price, even though people are probably going to think, why isn't he higher? He should be in a tier above, right? He should be number 5 in the tier of elites, but I just can't do it here with Kincaid this year.
I'm with you. I wish I felt differently, but he worries me.
Yeah, so and I obviously, this whole section of tight end is geared for me around getting Engram anyways. I like Engram better than Kincaid straight up. And if I'm on the clock with those two, I'm going to pick Engram. And so I'd rather wait 2 rounds and pick Engram, which is something that I've been able to do successfully in mocks. So, all right, so let's move on now. Going into the 3rd tier, the set starter. So I have a singular guy in this tier here because I really do feel like after this player that there's a drop in tight end in a way that I'm going to just wait. If I miss on the top 7, if I miss on my top 7 ranks here, I'm just going to try and get a guy at the end of the draft, especially in 10-team leagues. We'll get into the rest of those guys here in a second, but the guy in this tier is George Kittle. I really feel like he's just a set it and forget it tight end. But the reason he gets his own tier and the reason I haven't pushed below the other 2 is because of the crowded offense. There's 3 other weapons in the receiving game that are above him. And even as good as he is, being the number 4 option is just always going to limit upside to a certain extent. So there will be games where he pops off. I mean, he had a game last year. We had 3 catches, 63 yards, and 3 touchdowns. All right, so he can do it. He's obviously extremely talented. He can work down the field. He can work in the middle of the field. He can work in the short area. One of the best tight ends in the league now for multiple years. But so the only thing against him is the crowded offense. If any one of those 3 players were to get hurt, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, or Christian McCaffrey, he's going to get pushed up into tier 1, right? And he's going to be ranked 4 or 5 on a weekly basis until that player comes back. Drafting him, I feel very confident that it's just set it and forget it, even when he's not performing very well. Like if he has 2 or 3 week stretch where he doesn't perform very well, I don't really care about that when I have him. I'm just putting him in my lineup, and what the big weeks will come. So I think the price is fair at 7. You can get him right around Evan Engram. They kind of go hand in hand at the same point in the draft. And another element to this too, if you're watching this, like say 3 weeks down the line from when we are recording this, and Brandon Ayuk has been traded, just put him into the 4 spot. I would move him ahead of McBride if Ayuk gets traded. I really think that he would become more of a featured, consistent part of the offense. Ricky Pearsall, I think they would try to have, develop as part of their offense within his rookie season, but I think Kittle would take on a big portion of that workload if Ayuk is traded. Tier 4, getting into number 8. I labeled this tier, I draft another. So if I do draft anybody 8 and down, I would probably want to try and get a second tight end. A guy that you could have got last year, for example, if you did double dip at tight end, was like Sam LaPorta, right? Or you could have got, I can't even think of who else was being drafted, Dalton Kincaid down low. There were other tight ends down here too, David Njoku maybe, right? Where, you kind of want to take a second shot just in case you get a good player out of it, and then you can cut the guy you're not using. But number 8, going with Kyle Pitts.
Oh, everyone's favorite player. Tough year for him. In our home league, I kept him in my lineup for way too long before eventually cutting him, and I think I picked up Engram in a trade. But Pitts, he's a great athlete. He's more like a wide receiver. He's had the highest ADOT amongst tight ends all 3 seasons. Last year, he had a lingering injury that seemed to zap some of the athleticism. There's all these positive cases that you could spin for Kyle Pitts, but none bigger than the addition of Kirk Cousins and the new offensive regime coming in, and he's getting pushed up once again. And it seems like this year we're doing the Kyle Pitts thing again, but for me personally, I just feel like I'm going to be avoiding him because I don't want to fall into this same trap again for however many years it's been. There's other guys that I would just rather have on my team, and maybe I'll eat my words, and maybe Cousins will turn him into the guy that we thought he could be after a promising 1,000-yard rookie season. But I'm kind of just done with Pitts. I know that's a boring, dumb take, but that's kind of where my heart's at.
Yeah, and I think too with Pitts, he's getting pushed way above this again too, right? I mean, he's over Kittle, he's over Engram, right? So in ADP, he's actually going 6th, and he's up in that second tier according to the drafters. And I just can't do that. Like, how long are we gonna beat our head against the wall before we just wait to see it? And I get that doing that allows somebody else to get a good value if he does hit, right? Building on that 1,000-yard season, if he does go 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns, then like, okay, yeah, we should have had him higher. But there's a long track record now, right? Of not long, I guess, but there is a track record of him just not even being playable, being droppable. I mean, he's been dropped in both seasons so far. So it's just like, I don't know. I am with you. I can't do it either. I have him 8 here just because, right, the upside that we were talking about, we understand that the offense is going to be better. We understand the new coaching staff should have a vested interest in getting him the ball, but I agree with you. I just can't do it. I'm just going to be waiting and drafting kind of 2 of these other guys we're about to talk about. So number 9, I like this player a lot. And again, like, the other thing about Pitts is he's not going to be going here. Somebody is going to take him earlier than this. And so, this guy is the player that at the end, in a 10-team league especially, right, if everybody's kind of filled in their tight end, nobody's really going for a second tight end, you're in round 10, round 11. Jake Ferguson's one of my favorite players to draft at that point. He had an established role last year, right? Michael Gallup moved on. Not to say that that's going to affect his targets very much. Gallup wasn't very relevant. But they do have a very concentrated offense in Dallas, and we saw in the playoff game his upside, right? He scored 3 times. That's obviously not something you can expect, but I do think that there's a reason to believe that he could get to 8 touchdowns on the season. And, he was very productive. He had multiple games over 70 yards last year, which is kind of the tight end teetering point, right? Because you can get double-digit points with 70 yards and be a decent producer at the position if you can do that with any sort of regularity. And so for me, I think the good offense, concentrated offense, has a chance to be the number 2 option in the offense over Brandon Cooks. And so I'm actually really happy to get Ferguson later in the draft.
Yeah, I like Ferg, and I have him at 8. And if I'm on the clock, I'm taking him above Pitts. I mean, he led all tight ends in red zone targets last year. His expected touchdowns were closer to 9 if you're looking at advanced stats. I don't know, like you said, with it being a concentrated offense, like I just think that we've seen Dak target tight ends, especially in the end zone, quite a bit over his career. And I think he's a good player to attack, assuming you miss the top 7 for me here.
Yeah. No, that's good to know that you have him even up a spot over Pitts. So both in on Ferguson this year. Definitely like the fact that you can get him later as well. All right, so number 10, David Njoku. I struggled with ranking Njoku because obviously he was great last year with Flacco. And the fact that the Browns see that and wouldn't want to keep him in that role or try and get Watson to emulate that role for him is something that's difficult to wrap your mind around, right? It seems like somebody that productive and that skilled should be extremely involved in the offense. So I don't know. I feel like I should have him higher, but I just don't. And I don't know. What do you think? What were you going to say?
It's so tough with Njoku because it's not his talent, right? Like we've seen how easily he can take over games. This is all an issue of Deshaun Watson versus Joe Flacco. So last year in the 6 games with Flacco, he averaged 6.2 receptions, 80 yards a game, scored 4 touchdowns. The 5 games with Watson, he averaged 4 receptions, 42 yards per game, and 1 touchdown. The year prior to that, when Watson didn't start until week 13, Njoku averaged 5.6 half PPR games. So we have kind of a small window of 2 years, and Flacco he can't move, so he just stands there and dumps it off, whereas Watson, he either doesn't like targeting tight ends or he just takes off and scrambles. And they added Jerry Jeudy to this offense. Like, as much as I love him as a player, like it's tough for me because you can talk yourself into Njoku and turn on the tape, right? And then, he's a guy that could be cut after week 3 pretty easily.
Yeah, and then somebody else in your league adds him, and then he starts going off again later in the year. It's just like I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't feel like drafting Njoku gives you the set it and forget it element, but the upside here is apparent. And if he is going to be the number 2 option behind Cooper, and he is going to be in a featured role like he was with Flacco, and not saying he's going to produce at the same level as he did over the 6 games with Flacco. I'm just saying the role is the same, where you're getting the same number of targets, right? You mentioned how much additional production there was. There's like 2.5 receptions per game. So the volume was just completely different. So Njoku, back into the top 10. So if you are in a 10-team league, right, this is kind of the last starter, according to us. Or did you say you had him at 10 and Pitts at 9?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So we have the same top 10 players here at tight end. So this is kind of your last starter, but obviously we're going to get into 5 more names here. So going into number 11, somebody that I personally really like as well is Dallas Goedert. I've been seeing him get pushed down 12, 13, and I get it because he's going to be the number 4 option theoretically now, with Saquon Barkley coming in and taking on a big role in the passing game. But I just think that the talent here is really high, and every year when Ertz was there, it was always like, when is he going to leave so Goedert can take over the full tight end snap share? And he did, and we didn't really rank Goedert much differently for very long. So I think that he's somebody that in the middle of the field can really dominate, and in the past that was his main role because the receivers were staying on the outside. Now I don't think that that's going to be the offense anymore. I do think the receivers are going to be navigating the middle of the field, especially deep middle of the field. But I do expect Goedert to still be, an 18 to 20% target share. And with that much work, I do think he can be a viable fantasy starter. And maybe I'm wrong on the volume, right? And if I am, then you're going to need a different tight end. So that's why I kind of have said here as a tier in general that you want to draft the second one. But I think that Goedert does have a chance to even move up a tier, right? Where he could become a set starter if his role is secure with 20% target share. And then the 2 outside receivers, AJ Brown gets 25 and Smith gets 20 or something like that. I could see him being very useful. And the other thing about Goedert, every time he's been on the field, he's kind of cut in to Devontae Smith's targets and into his role. And when Goddard's been out, Smith has been significantly better. So when they're both on the field, I do think that there's an element to it that Goedert actually does impact one of the wide receivers, and that Goedert is a valuable player for the offense as a whole.
Yeah, I tend to agree with all of that, and I think, like you mentioned, with the new offensive system, they're going to be more creative than they were last year. So, assuming he can stay healthy, I think he'll kind of be a borderline starter, which is where we have him.
Yeah. All right, in tier 5. So these are a lot of tickets. These are the guys that if you draft one in tier 4, maybe grab one in tier 5. Hope that you get some upside here. And some of these names are going to be pretty familiar here, starting with Brock Bowers.
Yeah, so Bowers to me is really hard to rank. I mean, he's been the best tight end in college football at Georgia the last 3 seasons. He's kind of played a little bit more like a wide receiver. I mean, he only lined up in line about half the time, 37% of the time in the slot, almost 10% outside. And, it's not like Georgia didn't have elite pass catchers on their team as well, which kind of just shows Bowers' level of, talent and ability. I am a little bit bummed that he went to the Raiders. I think there were other situations where had he gone to, it would have been, we would have him, maybe in that tier 3 position. But it is what it is. With the Raiders' likely starter being Gardner Minshew, he's not going to be a high ADOT guy. And Bowers, if he can, we know Minshew likes to lock onto one guy, and I assume that will be Davante Adams. But I guess the only thing that I can kind of think of, and they kind of shut down these rumors a couple weeks ago. If you do have Bowers on your team and the Raiders start 1-5, and there's trade rumors happening, and Davante Adams ends up getting traded, then this guy could be a second half stud. But I don't love the situation, love the talent. It's tough having 2 tight ends on your roster, especially if you get one of the top 7 guys. But again, just kind of wish he went to a different system.
Yeah, and on Bowers, right? I mean, I have him ranked at 12, but I definitely struggle with just rookie tight ends in general. I just don't necessarily think they always work out. And this is not the year to be saying that either, right? I mean, you look at our top 6, and 3 of them were rookies last year. 3 of them showed out in a big way, especially in the second half. LaPorta was a little bit more all year, but the other 2, especially in the second half, showed what they can do. And so, Bowers, if he is as good as a player, right, and he was a better prospect than these other 3 guys, he can step in immediately and make a difference, I think. There is an opening as the number 2 target. I mean, as much as we like Jakobi Meyers, if he really is as talented as advertised, that's not going to be a block for him to get to be the number 2 target getter in the offense. And, like we said, Minshew kind of locks onto one guy, but he locks onto one receiver. And so maybe it's the Adams and Bowers show. And if Adams gets traded, maybe it's Jakobi Meyers kind of stepping into the number 1 role, and Bowers' role doesn't change much. So there is a path, right, is what I'm trying to say here for Bowers. It's just I am not entirely sold on rookie tight ends in general. And we see what happens when it's Kyle Pitts, right? And we just continue to go back to the well with him and continue to be disappointed. So that's why I have him down here. A lot of rankers have him at 9, 10, because of the upside. And I'm just not willing to go there.
Cool.
I don't know what happened. All right, number 13, TJ Hockenson. So this one's pretty obvious, I think, right? I mean, we know who TJ Hockenson is. We know what kind of producer he can be. The only reason he's down here is because of the ACL tear at the end of last year. And so I expect him to start on the PUP, but if he is ready by week 5, this is going to be too low of a ranking. He should be in the tier above and probably ahead of Jake Ferguson if he's only going to miss 5 games. Now, if he misses 7, 8 games, this is probably going to be too high because, I shouldn't say it like that. Depending on how many IR slots you have, right? If you have 4 IR slots, you should be fine, right? You can just put him there, and when he's ready to play, you'll plug him in at tight end and activate him. But if you only have 2 or 1, and as guys get hurt, you're going to end up dropping him. If you need a roster spot, and you're getting into week 6 and 7, and there's still not any sort of definitive news on exactly when he's coming back, or if he's still, on the practice field, gets his window opened, and it's still ramping up. Maybe you don't feel as confident about starting him right away, and you end up cutting him. But I think at this point, it's for sure worth it to take a shot on him. I know, like, if you look at Fantasy Pros ADP, I think he's down at 17. But I definitely push him up, especially in 10-team leagues, because at this point, you're probably towards the end of your draft. You might as well take a shot on a guy that you know can give you production at this spot. And if you get, say, David Njoku, and he's going through the first 4 weeks and he's just not cutting it, and Hockenson comes back in week 5, you're going to be really glad that you invested that draft pick in him.
I agree.
All right, number 14, Pat Freiermuth.
Yeah, so Freiermuth, I've never really had him on my teams, and he's kind of an interesting potential bounce back candidate this year. I didn't even realize he was only 25 years old. We've seen productive seasons out of him, particularly his rookie year where he scored 7 touchdowns. We know that Deontay Johnson is gone, which vacates a lot of targets, and there's not a whole lot of target competition outside of George Pickens on this team. And last year, Freiermuth obviously had a down year, but he had some nagging injuries, obviously had poor QB play on top of that. And, the wild card is, Arthur Smith joining as the offensive coordinator. And, although the narrative around him is how awful he is for fantasy owners, he has targeted tight ends at the highest rate since 2021 and inline tight ends at the third highest rate since 2021. So just because it wasn't the guy we wanted, we can't just ignore that Jonnu Smith had 50 catches and 580 yards last year. Freiermuth sitting at 14, he might not even necessarily get drafted this year on 10-team leagues, maybe even in 12-team leagues, but he is someone I could see if he ends up being the number 2 target getter, being a pretty high waiver priority as the season goes on.
Yeah, I think so too. And, this is higher than he's being drafted. But like you said about Wilson and about Arthur Smith, I mean, they both like the tight end. And the offense, I don't think they have another tight end on the roster. So, maybe I'm wrong.
They have Darnell Washington, but he's kind of like the big blocking.
Yeah, he's a big block. He's like 6'7". Yeah.
Yeah, he's like
I don't think he's gonna play the Jonnu Smith role and steal all the targets from Freiermuth. But at this price, if that does happen, you just cut him, right? And so it's not a huge deal if that happens, but in the event where the tight end targets are concentrated on Freiermuth and in the event that he is the number 2 option, I think that there is some decent upside here with this pick in a way that other tight ends in this area aren't going to have, right? You want to try and get a guy that can actually produce. And like you said about his rookie season, we saw him have 7 touchdowns. So we know he can score. We know he's a big-bodied tight end, and I'm hoping that he has a good season this year. All right, and then number 15, this is one of my favorite players, and it's a shame that he's down here at 15, but Dalton Schultz. This is, again, not about the player, but this is about the system or the situation, because he's got 3 wide receivers now with Diggs, Nico, and Tank Dell that are going to be dominating the target share. And it's unique in the fact that there's 3 of them. There isn't very many other situations where there's 3 wide receivers that are going to be commanding so many targets. So unfortunately, I think pushing him down to 4, plus you have to deal with Joe Mixon, who's also going to get targeted. So maybe he's even 5th in the, in the target share when we look up at the end of the year. And so unfortunately, I think that just makes him difficult to draft. The offense overall is going to be great. And I think they're going to throw a lot. So if they are up at 38, 40 passes a game, and he is even getting 15%, that's 6 targets a game. Maybe that is enough to squeak out enough production, especially if he gets red zone targets. But, that's not something I want to be banking on with my starter. He's somebody that you could sit on your bench for 4 weeks. And if one of those receivers gets hurt, then he could step into a much bigger role like he had last year. But overall, I unfortunately am not that enthusiastic about drafting Dalton Schultz this year.
Yeah, I echo exactly what you said. If 1 or 2 guys goes down, he's going to be wheels up. But the way I picture it going is he'll have a game where he has 70 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he's going to be the hot waiver wire priority. And then the next week he's going to go 3 for 35 and get dropped again. So I love the team. Love CJ Stroud. But yeah, it's just tough in that pecking order.
And with that, that we finish out our top 15 tight ends, and we look forward to talking to you in the next one. Thank you, guys.